Hi, this podcast is going to cover the organization of the periodic table. I highly recommend that you have a copy of the periodic table next to you and take notes on that as you are watching this podcast. So this is the periodic table you will be using over the course of this semester. Each of the elements is listed on this periodic table, and on this specific table you will be given the names and the symbols of the elements. A lot of times it's much more convenient for us to deal with the symbol of the element as opposed to writing out the entire name. So for example, carbon is a capital C, and so your symbol will be denoted either by a one letter or by two letters, and that first letter is always going to be capitalized. So for example, neon would be a capital N and a lowercase e. Most of the time the name, the symbol of the element follows the name. So carbon is a capital C, neon is Ne. However, sometimes the name or the symbol does not follow the name. So for example, iron is a capital F followed by an E. So in addition to being given the names and the symbols of the elements are also divided into three main groups: metals, which are going to be on the left side of the periodic table, nonmetals, which will be on the right side of the periodic table, and metalloids, which are going to appear along this step line between the metals and the nonmetals. So again, I highly recommend that you take this information from this picture on the slide and put it on your own periodic table. So what you will notice in orange is there is a stair step starting up at boron, so starting right up here, and it goes all the way down to here. On the left side of that stair step, that's where you will find your metals. Metals tend to be shiny. They are malleable, which means that you can bend them and pound them out into thin sheets. They are ductile, which means they can be drawn into wires, and they are very good conductors of electricity and heat. Nonmetals are going to be found on the right side of the stair step, so they are going to be found on the other side. You will need to make sure that you remember that hydrogen, although it does sit on the left side of the periodic table, it is a nonmetal, and so it is shaded in brown on this particular slide. They tend to be dull. They are poor conductors of electricity and heat. And then your metalloids on this slide are highlighted in yellow, and they're going to have properties of both metals and nonmetals. It is very, very important that you are able to identify an element as a metal or nonmetal or metalloid, because it will have a huge impact on its behavior, and it will have a huge impact on how and what it bonds to. So the next piece on the periodic orientation, I want to talk about the building block elements, and those are going to be hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and carbon. This is a health note, and you do want to make a note anytime we talk about a health note on one of these podcasts. You are going to want to make a note of it. These will also be found in your guided practice. But these four elements are going to make up 96% of the mass of the human body, and they're going to be the main components of things like proteins, nucleic acids, fats, and carbs. On the slide, we also want to talk a little bit about periodic law and how the periodic table was organized and put together. It was actually organized by a gentleman named Mendeleev, and he organized the elements in terms of increasing atomic number, which we'll talk about in a moment, but he also organized it in terms of properties. And in our next slide, we'll talk about how each group of elements, so for example, if I talk about this very last column right here, we'll find that these elements all have very similar properties, and so they were organized to fall in a row just like that. Okay, So as we just talked about in the last slide, the way the periodic table is organized, first organized in terms of properties. So you will find that elements that fall in a specific column are going to have very specific properties. And these are called families or groups. And again, those are going to be found in vertical columns, and they're labeled 1A through 8A. And you can see the labeling up here at the very top of a column. It's very small on this slide. But again, these elements are going to have very similar properties, and as we will see a little bit later on, they're going to have very similar electronic properties. Now going across, that is called a period, and each period or row will be numbered. And again, that's going to be found right here along the side of the periodic table, and so period will go across. And there are 7 periods on the periodic table. In a little bit, what we will see is that the elements that fall inside of a period are going to have a very similar size. All right, so there are going to be 5 special groups that you are going to need to know. The first are the 1A, or fall in family 1A. That's that very first column. So 1A right here. Those are called the alkali metals. They are extremely reactive. The next group you're going to need to know are the alkaline earth metals. They are in group 2A, so they're right next to the alkali metals. I'm going to jump down to the halogens. These are in group 7A, so they are right over here. And again, they are also going to be very, very reactive. As we'll talk about in a moment, these will be diatomic molecules. And the last family here are group 8A. Those are the noble gases. They're extremely stable. They generally do not react. The last set of elements, grouping of elements that you will need to know are the transition metals, and they are going to fall right in the middle. They are called the B block elements, and so they're going to fall right in here. Okay, so here we're going to practice identifying an element based on where it falls on the periodic table. So I'll be going through the first one with you. The last 4 are for you to do on your own. These can be found in your guided practice. And if you have any questions on these, make sure you bring these to class so that you can ask your instructor. Okay, so the first one we're going to be looking at, or the one we're going to be looking at together, is the element that falls in the 4th period and is an alkali metal. So the first thing I'm going to do is count down the number of periods. So I have period 1, period 2, period 3, and period 4. Now because I know where the alkali metals fall, remember the alkali metals fall in that very first family. So I'm going to go down to the alkali metal that falls into the 4th period, and we can see that it is potassium. So potassium would be the correct answer for that question. Okay, make sure you go through the next 4 on your own and let your instructor know if you have any questions.